Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another installment of Beards and Cars, my podcast style series where we talk about subjects or countdowns in a much more in-depth way that you just wouldn't have the time to in a regular, say, 5 to 10 minute video. Now, as you'll see in this video, if you stick around for the whole thing, I'm actually using this episode to debut Season 2 of my Gran Turismo Sport horror art car selection. So all three of the new ones in this video, which is the Saw Mustang, the Blob Cobra, and the Splinter Dodge Challenger, along with the three existing ones, which are the Babadook Chevy Nova, the Human Centipede Fiat 500, and what was the last one? The Stuff Mustang. Some of those horror movies I know are kind of obscure, but I'm a big horror fan, especially of obscure ones. So if you like any of the ones in this video, then of course you can click the link in the description and in my pinned comment. That'll take you straight over to the Gran Turismo Sport community, where you can add those liveries to your selection and to your collection if you like them. I love making these horror-inspired liveries, especially for horror movies that a lot of people haven't seen. But for this particular installment, as you saw from the title and the thumbnail, I wanted to talk about a topic which was a suggested one from the community, and we had a ton of great topics that I'm going to cover in coming weeks as well. But this one is one which is certainly more of a hot-button topic in a general sense. It's not just relating to Gran Turismo or Forza or the primary games that we talk about on this channel, because of course we cover a ton of different driving games, riding games, racing games. But the impetus of this installment is, again, as you saw from the title, my choice of 5 racing games, driving games, whatever you want to refer to them as, that desperately need a sequel. And not just that they deserve a sequel, because there are tons of games that you could say deserve a sequel, but more importantly than that, ones that actually deserve a sequel now more than ever, because directly of the current climate of gaming. Now, the first one is a perfect example of this because it's Enthusia 2. I strongly believe that if we had an Enthusia 2, it would do outstandingly well. And the reason why is because if you think back to the first Enthusia game, for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a PlayStation 2 title. I believe it was exclusive to the PlayStation, but I may be wrong. And basically, it's the best Gran Turismo rival we've ever had. Because a lot of people put Forza up against Gran Turismo, but the only reason why is because they're the two obvious choices. They're actually not as similar as people think. Gran Turismo has always been trying to be like real life, whereas Forza has always tried to be more fun than real life. They go the extra mile to make it more fun, more colourful, more pop and bang, which I actually love both approaches. They're refreshing when you play one and then go over to the other. But Enthusia is much similar, or much more similar to Gran Turismo than it is to Forza, because it came out at around a similar time. I believe it was just after Gran Turismo 4, and at that time in the market, sim racing, or at least the closest to it that we had at the time, wasn't anywhere near as much of a thing as it is now. Now, there were sim games, or at least the PlayStation 2 equivalent of it. You had, at around a similar time, I think, Total Immersion Racing. You had either Grid, or not Grid, GTR, I should say, or GTR 2, I believe, was a similar time. The TOCA Race Driver series, that might have been the third game in that franchise by that point. So there were other options, but Gran Turismo easily dominated that market because Forza was just getting started with the first game, and they quickly made a name for themselves, but still, Gran Turismo 4 easily dominated the market. So along comes Enthusia from, I believe is it Konami or Atari? I can't remember the brand. I think it might have been Konami. I think Atari is Test Drive Unlimited, actually. And I actually think that Enthusia is an outstanding rival to Gran Turismo because it's much more similar than Forza is. You've got the more muted colours, the softer shapes, the more technical, almost nerdy details, because I would summarise the Forza and Gran Turismo franchises by saying that Gran Turismo is nerdy, Forza is geeky. Because there is a difference. Nerds are just pure down-to-the-facts kind of people who don't care about social status, whereas geeks are basically nerds with social sense. They're more like hipsters, that kind of thing. So Forza is definitely the more geeky of the two. It's nerdy to a degree, but it also has social sense. It's got the flashy colours, the funky music, whereas Gran Turismo is just pure nerd. Numbers, technical stuff, and again, I love both of those approaches. Now, Enthusia definitely swings more toward nerd, and in some ways, it almost feels even more nerdy than Gran Turismo does. There's a great car selection. If I recall, I think there was something like 200 or 300 cars, so it didn't really compare to Gran Turismo's 700 at the time. But the graphics, I've said before in this series, I actually think they hold up better than Gran Turismo 4's graphics do. The cars aren't as interesting for the most part, but the graphics look more subtle, and the blemishes in the graphics, if that makes sense, don't show up quite as obviously as they do with Gran Turismo. The track selection is interesting. There aren't as many real circuits, which is unfortunate, but the cars are really interesting, the ones that are on there. Most of them tend to have a very Gran Turismo 2 vibe, where they're like real cars. You've got like minivans, hatches, sedans. You've even got Saab on that game, which I think is pretty cool. You've got the Smart for 2, various other ones. I believe the Morris Minor was on that game as well, which most people probably wouldn't care about, but I think that's actually pretty cool. Not the car, but that the game had it. And you even had Door on that game. Not the 962 road car, unfortunately, but they had the Door EB110, because after Bugatti liquidated, Door continued production of the EB110 for a little while in an even more powerful form. So there were some pretty cool cars in that game. Some rally cars as well. I believe the Citroen DS was in that game. I think we had, if I recall correctly, the BMW M1 Pro car, I think, was in that game, which for the time, that's actually really impressive. It would be a long time before Forza or Gran Turismo even came close to that kind of thing. I think the Audi Pikes Peak Quattro, or at least the S1 Quattro, was in the game. The MG Metro 6R4 might have even been, I can't recall. But there were some pretty cool cars in that game for the time. So it kind of had the Forza approach to its car list, where there weren't as many as Gran Turismo, but it had a really good, strong selection of types of car and manufacturer. And the reason why I think it deserves a sequel, even though honestly I don't think it's going to happen, not unless somebody buys out the rights and remakes it, but I think that the reason why it deserves a sequel more than ever is because of a combination of three things, actually. One is the market. One is people's opinion of Gran Turismo currently, and one is people's opinion of Forza currently. Now, the market, in an overall sense, definitely lends itself towards having an Enthusia 2, because Sims are now more popular, arguably, than they've ever been, at least in the mainstream. They've always had their strong, loyal fans, but now they're becoming more of an accepted thing. Kind of like that music that you liked before it became popular, and now everyone likes it, where you've got AC, you've got Project Cars, various PC-based ones, but it's a much more known, more accepted, more widely loved thing. So Enthusia, I think, would be perfect for a sequel at this time. Maybe you have the same amount of cars, but on the PS4, maybe the Xbox One as well. Could be an exclusive, probably would be. But you've got an interesting car selection, doubtless great graphics, because the first one was outstanding in that regard, and they put a lot of thought into that game. Even though it wasn't a bestseller, as far as I'm aware, they did put a huge amount of effort into it, and that is refreshing to see. So I think Enthusia 2 would be a great game to see. I would definitely play it. I'd do a ton of content for it. I still plan to do a ton of content for the first one. So that's my first pick. My second pick is perhaps not as obvious, and it's not traditionally a racing game as such, which is why at the start of the video I said racing or driving games. And that is where this one very literally comes in, because I would like to see a sequel to Driver. Because, in particular, Driver San Francisco, I think, is a masterpiece. It's one of my favourite driving games ever. It's not a racing game at all, really. There are some races in it, but not really. But the concept of the game is so good. The graphics actually hold up really well in a more fun kind of way. And some of the physics in that game, some of the sound effects, some of the little details, I would say are easily better and more fun than Gran Turismo or Forza once again. Stuff like the tyre smoke looks fantastic. The way the car actually shakes from side to side when you rev, like an actual muscle car should. The way when you put it in reverse gear, the guy puts his palm on the steering wheel to reverse and turns with one hand like you actually would in real life. The way when you turn a hard corner, he actually crosses his hands on the steering wheel to turn, because the car doesn't have power steering. These really, really cool little details. Plus, the map is outstanding, easily one of my favourite open world driving, free roaming maps. It's not necessarily quite Test Drive Unlimited level, but still, it's very cool. One of the best city-based circuits, or city-based maps for sure. And what I would love to see in a newer one is some kind of like handing on of that concept. Now the problem with that would be that I'm not going to spoil anything, but the reason why that game works so well in terms of what you can do is because it's based on a particular story, and the story definitely allows the physics in that game to happen. And if you've played the game, you know what I mean. There are certain things that you can do in that game that are directly linked to the story and what happens to the character. And it would be hard to repeat that. So I'm not sure what they do in a second game. Because to me, one of the coolest things about Driver San Francisco is that you can jump out of the car, Matrix style, into like a god's eye view, and then look around the map, select any random car, and jump into it. So you don't like hijack the car like GTA style, you just become the driver, like the Matrix. And that's so cool, just being able to hop from car to car, plus you can cause absolute carnage with it. You jump into a big rig, you jackknife it across the road, then jump into a different car, and you've created a pile-up. It's really cool. You can do cop chases, running from cops, there are street races, and there's an overarching story, which is actually a relatively rare thing for a racing game. It tends to be just stuff like Need for Speed that has a story, and they're generally not very good, whereas the story in Driver, it's actually fun. It's got a very 70s kind of Lethal Weapon meets cop procedural kind of story to it. It's cool, it's got some interesting, not quite supernatural, but that kind of thing, elements to it. I would love to see a sequel to Driver San Fran, or just a sequel to Driver in general. You could do a sequel specifically to San Fran, but I don't think they would do that. I do believe that of the 5 on this list, a Driver sequel is probably one of the most likely, because at the end of the day, it is a beloved franchise. People love all of the Driver games. So it's actually surprising to me, unless I've missed something, that they haven't already done one. Because it's been a while, it's been a minute since Driver San Fran, and yet they still haven't done a sequel as far as I'm aware. Unless, of course, I'm just wrong on that. But get on that, guys. We need another Driver game, especially if it's as good as that. Now, speaking of racing games, or riding games even, that deserve a sequel, and also that have a bit more of a chance of that actually happening, the next one is one of the ones that I want to happen the absolute most. And there have been some rumblings that it could happen. Not that it is, but that it could. And at least that is more than we can say for something like Enthusia 2. Or at least for a Driver game at this point. And that is Tourist Trophy 2. And there's a certain portion of the audience watching this video who just went, yes, because those of us who love Tourist Trophy really love Tourist Trophy. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, maybe you're not a motorbike fan in general, I of course do cover motorbike content on the channel. I've done some Tourist Trophy stuff, I would like to do a lot more, and I plan to. We've done Ride, we've covered the bikes in Project Gotham, that kind of thing. And I've also, as many of you guys saw in my channel updates, I've bought a couple of new to me riding games from the PS2, RS, RS2 and Superbike Challenge. So I do definitely have more content in mind for that kind of thing, as well as the obvious ones like Ducati World, all that good stuff. But Tourist Trophy is easily the big daddy. As far as I'm concerned, there has never been any other motorbike exclusive game that even comes close to Tourist Trophy. Now, Ride is great. As a franchise, as a specific game, Ducati World is great, but of course you only have Ducatis, it's a PS1 game so it doesn't hold up super well for graphics, and there are some others which are beloved, but Tourist Trophy's the daddy. Easily, because Tourist Trophy, for those who haven't played it, is Gran Turismo 4 with bikes. And that is pretty awesome. Now, there are some drawbacks to the game. The fact that career mode isn't really as in-depth as Gran Turismo, which is understandable, it is more of an offshoot game. Tourist Trophy is to Gran Turismo kind of what Horizon is to Forza. It's not the meat of the series, but it's one which could definitely become a really popular offshoot. And of course that has happened with the Horizon franchise. Horizon 3 is a masterpiece. Horizon 4 is got a ton of expectation. I've already pre-ordered mine. As far as Tourist Trophy 2 goes, people want to see it happen. They've asked Kaz about it. He said that it could happen. Not necessarily that they're in active development, especially with all the focus being on GT Sport at the moment, but I do definitely think that there is room in the market for a Tourist Trophy 2. And I would actually like to see something, not necessarily like Gran Turismo Sport for Tourist Trophy, but maybe something that's kind of like a fusion of what it was and Gran Turismo Sport. So those amazing physics, much more detailed graphics, the kind of layout of the game, but just substitute the cars for bikes. I think that would actually work really well, because most of the drawbacks that some, including myself on occasion, have with GT Sport, such as the lack of career mode from day one, the lack of cars from day one, which of course they are adding updates to fix that, but still, we paid for a game in the first place. You shouldn't have to buy something hoping for it to get good eventually. But be that as it may, Tourist Trophy actually could benefit from that kind of game, because if you go into it knowing that that's going to happen, as many people did not know about Gran Turismo Sport, many of us did. I knew that the game was going to have a lot of DLC, that it didn't include a lot of stuff. After all, I played the demo, played the beta, blah blah blah. But with Tourist Trophy, people who have played GT Sport would already have an inkling of what to expect. Maybe the career mode would be limited, but in the case of that game, if it had a similar amount of vehicles from day one that GT Sport did, that would actually be really good for a bike game. Because the first Tourist Trophy had, I think it was about 300 bikes, something like that. So you'd probably be looking at paring that down a little bit, maybe more like 100, 150, because it's on the PS4. They've got to update all the graphics, add newer bikes. There are loads of bikes which weren't even on that game, of course, because of the time that it came out. So I would love to see a Tourist Trophy 2. I think it's the perfect time for it, because if you think about it, when it came out, you actually did have some rivals. You've got the MotoGP games, you've got the bike aspects of Test Drive Unlimited, you've got Riding Spirits, RS2, Superbike Challenge. There are quite a few options, at least, even Project Gotham. But now, if you're thinking of motorbike games, well, can you even think of any? I mean, maybe there's a current MotoGP game, but that's just for the hardcore fans, really. For average Joes who just like motorbikes in general, myself included, there isn't really much to go on. You've basically just got bikes as an addendum to other games, like The Crew, where they're not the main focus of the game. So I would actually love to see a Tourist Trophy 2 happen. I think it's a great time for it. And if anything, it would actually help to, I think, increase the goodwill of Polyphony if they were to make a second game, because a lot of people who have dropped away from GT Sport, and there are still a lot of people who have dropped and haven't come back, you can easily tell that from the numbers even here on the channel, then that would potentially bring them to a different game, so Polyphony would still be making money because people have just gone to a different game within the same overarching company. I would be playing both, for sure, and I know that many of you guys would as well. But yeah, I think it's a great time for Tourist Trophy 2. I think that if it is going to happen, don't expect it probably for at least another year or two, probably more, because again, Polyphony is very strongly focused on GT Sport. And the next one is much more even, of an arcade approach, but it's a game that I have a lot of love for, one of the games in particular, and it's a franchise which has a huge amount of love from its community. And that community is, of course, the Xbox exclusive Project Gotham racing community. Very few games that don't have a current game in the spotlight, or haven't had for years, literally years. I mean, when was the most recent Project Gotham 4? Like 2011? Something like that. It's literally almost a decade ago. And yet, when I put out videos for Project Gotham 3 and 4, they still get the views, because people still love those games. And that is a testament to how ripe the market is to have a return. Now, I've mentioned before in other videos that I believe Turn 10 was at least looking into, if not actually buying, the devs of Project Gotham and buying the rights to it. Now, I don't know why they would do that, because if they were to remake it, it would kind of clash with the Horizon games. But maybe they do plan to, maybe even some kind of roll in between the two, but I don't know, that doesn't seem likely. But the beauty of Project Gotham, for those who haven't played it, maybe haven't had an Xbox, for instance, but the beauty of those games, the fourth one in particular, where motorbikes really, again, got into the mix, Midnight Club style, is Project Gotham treads the very fine line, but it treads it very well, between arcade and sim. And the result is, although it doesn't have everything that either of those communities would typically want, especially the sim side, it gives you enough good stuff on either side of the fence that both audiences can enjoy it. And in effect, that's in a funny kind of way similar to what I do with this channel. I don't specialise in only one game, because by specialising in so many, I have all of these pocket audiences who come to the channel for one or two different games, or one or two franchises. Very few people play all of them, but those of us who do can see the good in a lot of different games and a lot of different franchises. Because the simple fact is, even if there's a franchise or a particular game that you aren't a fan of, there are other people who are a fan of it. And there are definitely things within each of these games, even the trashy ones, that make them redeemable, worth at least playing once, for the most part. Now, in the case of Project Gotham, there's a lot to love. It's such a good franchise at what it does, and although it seems like a franchise which could have a lot of rivals, it actually doesn't. Because if you think about it, it's technically an arcade game, and yet it's totally based on circuit racing. And in some occasions, around real tracks, like the Nordschleife. That's actually not that common a concept. Because most of the arcade games, in particular, that have that kind of flair, tend to also have some kind of open world or street racing element, whereas Project Gotham, yes, it does take place for the most part on streets, but they're contained streets, so it's kind of like Street Racer meets Circuit Racer, in a very interesting kind of mix. But I would say by far, the most impressive thing about all of the Project Gotham games, but especially 4, is the vehicle selection, the vehicle lineup. Cars in particular, but bikes as well. It's so impressive. It really is amazingly good. In Project Gotham 4 in particular, there are some genuinely outstanding vehicles, be it cars or bikes, that neither Gran Turismo or Forza have ever had. Stuff like the Caparo T1, the original shape Gumper Apollo without the wing and with less power, the Cadillac 16 concept. My favourite vehicle of all time is in that game, the MTT Y2K motorbike. That's never been featured in any other game, period, unless it's a mod. So Project Gotham's vehicle selection, not just in the 4th game, but in all of them, has always been its strongest trait. And I think that the main thing in favour of a return for Project Gotham is actually the nostalgia. Because very few games, even ones like Enthusia, for instance, or the GTR franchise, or even something like Test Drive Unlimited, as many fans as they have, most franchises like that are not clamouring as vocally and as frequently as Project Gotham fans are for a return. Because the closest thing is Test Drive Unlimited, but most of those fans tend to be just of the first game, and then the second game has its own little sphere of fans as well, but people who played it from the first game generally don't like the second one as much, at least in my experience, and I definitely don't. As far as I'm concerned, the second game was a backstep in many ways. But with Project Gotham, it's like the game just came out last week. The fervour that the fans still have for that game is a beautiful sight to see. It's nice to see that kind of loyalty to a genuinely great series. And even though I've never had much interest in the career mode side of it, I've never played any of the career mode in 1, 2 and 3. In Project Gotham 4 I did a couple of races, got to like the level of owning a Buick Gen X or something, so I didn't play that far. But even in arcade mode alone, it makes the game worth playing. Because you can drive all of the cars, all of the bikes, on almost all of the tracks, right from day one. And that's just so fun to experience stuff like the Toyota GT1 road car, the Caparo T1, as I mentioned before, the Radical SR9 on a street, the Callaway Sledgehammer, the Alfa Romeo SZ even on the lower end of the spectrum, which isn't in that many games. There are so many awesome vehicles in that game. One of my favourite cars, actually, one of my dream cars, the Panos GTR1 road car. Such an awesome lineup of cars in that game. Now, I think that Project Gotham 5, if that were to come back now, I think it would have an interesting place in the market because it would have two very strong things going for it. One is that fan nostalgia, and never underestimate the power of nostalgia. It is a powerful marketing tool, and I think it would actually sell really well because of that. The second reason why I think it would sell well, and more importantly that it would keep people interested, is because it doesn't have many rivals now. The main rivals to a Project Gotham 5 would be Horizon 4 from Forza and The Crew 2. Apart from that, not much else. But really, if you think about it, neither of those are really direct rivals. They're rivals to each other because they have that open world vibe. But really, Project Gotham would still have a very unique place in the market, being an arcade approach to what would typically be a sim game, with lots of real cars, fully licensed vehicles, circuit racing, even with legendary tracks like the Nordschleife. It's a very interesting fusion of both philosophies, arcade and sim. It definitely swings more toward arcade, but it does it with a very sim approach. It's almost like certain movies, for instance, like Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979. Technically speaking, that's a B movie, but it's done to A-grade quality, which is why it's not just a great horror movie, it's a great movie, period. Likewise with Project Gotham, it's an arcade game, but it's nothing like the Crazy Taxis, the Stuntman games, those kind of very over-the-top fun approaches, but it feels more grounded than that. They actually have real vehicles, real specs. They at least try to make the vehicles feel semi-realistic to what they should feel like, at least in terms of how they compare to each other. So I would love to see a Project Gotham 5. I know a ton of you guys would as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, one which I would love to see return, but with a very big caveat. And that is, what better way to end than Test Drive Unlimited 3. Now, this one is easily the least likely to return because I believe Atari went bust or something. They couldn't afford to make another game. They shut down the servers, I believe, for both of the games, which is unusual given that the second one is still the newest thing. But Test Drive Unlimited has so much raw potential. And the first game, just like Project Gotham, still has this incredibly strong fan base who love the game so much. I would easily still put Test Drive Unlimited in my top 10 favourite driving games of all time, no question. It might even make my top 5, because it's such a good game. Is it the most realistic thing around? No, of course not, but it's not trying to be. It's a game which is about more than just driving, it's about more than just racing, it's about this entire lifestyle vibe. And it's not that buying houses or clothes is necessarily important in the game, beyond just having garage space, it's just this extra layer of immersion. And it's so cool. Now, I think that Test Drive Unlimited 3 could bring some potentially interesting new things to the table. Like, for instance, one thing that you would have to do is make bikes a crucial part of the game again, basically, because that's one of the things that the second game absolutely failed on. The bikes were DLC and there were only 3 of them, and they weren't that interesting. In the first game, the bikes are great. There weren't a huge amount of them, but they served a crucial role in being really good. You had Kawasaki, Ducati, MV Agusta, and Triumph. In the second game, you just had Ducati and Harley Davidson. The Harley was an interesting choice, but again, DLC, eh. And the cars themselves, you had some new ones. You had your Nissan R35, you had the Bugatti Veyron, you had the Koenigsegg CCXR edition, and a couple of other cool ones, but that doesn't even compare to the first game, especially when you factor in DLC, because in that first game, you've got the Cadillac CN concept, the Cadillac 16, which is my favourite concept car ever, the B-Engineering Adonis, which also just so happens to be one of my favourite cars ever. You've got the Mercedes CLK GTR road car, the Maserati MC12, a couple of other less obvious Maseratis like the 3500 GT, the classic. It's such a strong game. Just like Project Gotham, it has these choices which, for whatever reason, the big dogs of Forza and Gran Turismo seem to just overlook, despite the fact that many of us want those cars. Koenigsegg's, B-Engineering cars, Ascaris, Nobles, Farbauds, these really cool smaller companies that they've just never bothered with for the most part. Forza's had some, they had Ascari for instance, but Gran Turismo's never really bothered with that. They still don't even have Koenigsegg, despite the fact that so many fans want to see that happen. So I think that a Test Drive Unlimited 3 would be unlikely, mainly because of the financial situation, but I would love to see someone buy the rights and remake something, or not remake, but do a sequel that has the spirit and the vibe of that first game, but brings it into the modern age, maybe with more bikes, more of a maybe off-road aspect to the game as well, like the second one tried to have, But those are my picks for the 5 games that I'd like to see come back. I think there's a ton of potential there. And that's it for this instalment. So, of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on my 5 picks down below. And there are definitely other sequels which could happen as well. So slap those down below, your suggestions. Maybe a new Tokka game, a new Grid game, a new Stunt Driver game. Who knows? Maybe another Juiced game, Juiced 3 or something. So, of course, slap those down below. And, of course, I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.